5 seconds. Good afternoon and welcome to ICJ Kenya webinar on access to justice in the context of COVID-19, placing Wanjiku at the center. Now, this is the fifth in a series of webinars at ICJ Kenya that we have held since the COVID-19 pandemic in Kenya. The webinars have featured salient human rights issues amid COVID-19, and using this platform, and with your continued participation, we have demystified these issues. We have analyzed the law and policy framework, including gaps that exist. We have developed proposals for intervention. And with these proposals, we have developed advocacy interventions in keeping with our vision and mission at ICJ, which is to promote human rights, adherence to the rule of law, and access to justice. Keep your ears on the ground and follow us on our social media platforms at ICJ Kenya to find out what's in the menu in the coming weeks. But today our focus is on access to justice in the amidst COVID-19, and we have with us a panelist, a panel of eminent jurists who are joining us today. We have Honorable Justice David Majanja, who is a judge of the High Court, a commissioner at the Judicial Service Commission, the vice chairperson of the Judiciary Committee on Elections, and a member of ICJ Kenya. Welcome, Judge. We also have Dr. Linda Musumba, the chair of the Kenya Institute for Public Policy Research and Analysis. She's an advocate of the High Court of Kenya and a teacher of law. Karibu sana, Daktari. We have Don Dare, who is the executive director of the Pan-African Lawyers Union. He's an advocate of the High Court of Kenya and a member of the ICJ Kenya. Welcome, Don. We have Beatrice Njeri, who is an advocate of the High Court of Kenya and the senior legal officer at the Center for Human Rights Education and Awareness crew. Welcome, Beatrice. All right, I am your moderator, Teresa Mutua, working at ICJ Kenya, the program manager to the Democratic Governance and Rule of Law program.
And I'm Silas Kamanza. I'm program officer. I work with Teresa at ICJ Kenya, and I'm really glad that you are able to join us today. Thank you. Karibuni.
Thank you. So remember to send in your questions through this platform and through our YouTube channel, which we are live on, and through our Twitter page, that is ICJ Kenya. Send your questions indicating question or comment indicating comment, and to the person that you want to ask your question to. And my colleague Silas will pick up those questions and pose them to the panelists as we go along. Now, let me begin with you, Dawn. A lot of the discussions we've had on access to justice during this COVID-19 have revolved around the professionals. So the judiciary has had quite a few discussions on what the judiciary can do and should do during COVID-19 to stay open, you know, and opening the courts to the public. We've had lawyers talk about how to keep law firms open and their businesses open, but very few discussions have been had about what Wanjiku wants and what the needs of Wanjiku in terms of access to justice during COVID-19. So help us as we begin this discussion to, you know, just have an overall view of what are those needs of Wanjiku and why haven't we had that discussion so far? John.
Okay, thank you very much, Teresa, and also Silence and colleagues. I would say one thing at the outset. While the focus of the webinar is on Kenya, we're a number of panelists, so I suggest that I add value by trying to, where I can, bring in comparative national perspectives and also regional perspectives. And my co-panelists can speak with more details about the intricate details of our administration of justice system currently in Kenya. I do agree with you, though, that whereas, as far as we know, the National Council for the Administration of Justice in Kenya has met at least twice, possibly more times, issued at least 2 detailed communiques. A lot of the focus has been on the judiciary and how to make the judicial arm of government work. And we haven't yet seen more detailed thinking around the other members of the National Council for the Administration of Justice: public prosecutions, the police, prisons, probation services, witness protection services, and the other non-state members of the council, such as the law society and civil society. I'd also like to say in general that at the continental level, both the African Court, African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child have released comprehensive statements on what are the obligations of states with regard to the rule of law and the protection and promotion of human and people's rights in the context of a health-induced emergency. So these statements already emphasize very clearly the legal obligation of states, even in terms of an emergency. And just in terms of the African international courts and tribunals that I frequent, the East African Court of Justice has already sent out its course list for the appellate division for the next month. And starting literally next week, Tuesday, 19th May, till Wednesday, 10th June, they will be holding virtual sessions, scheduling conferences, hearings, deliverings of rulings and judgments, and so on. And they have opted to use Microsoft Teams platform, which we already tested last week. Both divisions of the court, the Registry and Select Council. The African Court on Human and People's Rights has also formally notified the public that it will hold its 57th ordinary session virtually. That will run from 1st to 26th June. So if you were to ask what are some of the nuanced access to justice challenges that Wanjiku and her sisters and brothers across the continent are facing, I would pick 3 that I think are not being sufficiently highlighted in the public discourse. And one is the right to information. Citizens across Kenya, across Africa, and in other places of the world are demanding better information, not just quantity of information, but also quality of information. They don't want to know just the statistics. They also want to know the details of the plans that the respective governments are taking, that the regional institutions are taking, or even considering. And even when we debate Wanjiku in this context, as you've correctly said, Teresa, we've had a conversation as judges, lawyers, maybe the apex private sector and so on, but not really with Wanjiku with regard to how we are tilting the administration of justice system to work for her. Another example, you see the government going online at 4 p.m. or thereabouts and announcing a new measure, such as wearing of face masks, and without giving people time to come to terms with it and to make preparations, within hours, the police are on the street enforcing it very vigorously against Wanjiku and her family members. Another is the right to public participation. Citizens want to be involved in these plans and as active participants, not just as passive recipients or subjects. Our own constitution, the Constitution of Kenya, elaborates very elaborately on the need for public participation. And we haven't seen this happen enough. Of course, freedoms of peaceful assembly, association, and expression are under attack, especially in countries that feel that suppression of information should form an integral part of their emergency response measures. In many places in Africa, 60 years after colonialism ended, serikali is still serikali. Government is still top secret, rather than one of the people, by the people, and for the people. And then, of course, there's a challenge of digitally sidelining Wanjiku as we take courts and other governmental processes online. So the Senate, for instance, has taken its public participation online, but it's essentially online. Our courts seem headed in the same direction. But going online is very expensive for Wanjiku because of the cost of electricity, cost of internet, cost of mobile devices, and so on. So if we don't take specific measures to include everyone, we'll end up with huge gaps in access to information, access to public participation, and access to justice. But we are seeing some good practices also. Yesterday, I came across a clip from the Nyandarua County Assembly, which has set up portals on WhatsApp, word by word, for soliciting written submissions for budget estimates from their people. So I would say that the Kenyan judiciary has tried more than its peers across the continent to maintain access to justice services during the crisis. Many other judiciaries have either stopped completely or are proceeding as though, we have no crisis, no virus in our midst. So Kenya was one of the early starters, so was South Africa, followed by Uganda. Nigeria, I think, has only begun taking the judiciary online in the last fortnight. But that's not to say that things are perfect. But it's also fair to say that in Kenya, I did a straw poll yesterday among colleagues and friends, many judicial officers are as frustrated as litigants and lawyers are with how the system is working. Assessing of filing fees is taking long. Online payment is a challenge in many places. Rapidly converting our overall criminal justice system to online procedures or distance procedures has not been so easy. So we seem to be in the early stages of making this the new normal way to work. And in these circumstances, in my view, individual acts of excellence count almost as much as institution-wide reforms to laws, policies, practices, guidelines, and so on. So we have a number of judges, magistrates, registry staff, IT staff that are worthy of recognition and commendation. I recently came across one such commendation by the Honorable Professor Justice Joel Ngugi, recommending one of his staff, IT staff, and I was quite enamored by it. I hope as time goes by, we'll see ICJ Kenya, LSK, FIDA, and other institutions also giving out both bouquets and barbs as the occasion calls for. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, John. Beatrice, just seeing what John is saying and building from that, what are some of you have worked for a very long time with vulnerable groups, both women and children, and their access to justice needs are specific and they are quite sensitive when we talk about them interacting with the justice system. So building up from what Dawn is saying in terms of what are the access to justice needs, kindly elaborate to us, in your opinion, what has come up during this COVID-19? What are the specific nuances and challenges that vulnerable groups, women and children, face during this time?
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you to my senior colleagues. I'm honored to be part of this panel. So just thinking around the many things, we are living in the Sustainable Development Goals time, and we keep speaking about leaving no one behind. However, COVID has now presented an even bigger challenge for the groups that have been previously left behind. In my mind and in my work, I have women, because I am not free until all women are free, even if their shackles are different from mine. That was said by Audre Lorde. And we as an organization have been facing challenges because we have constantly represented women and assisted women to represent themselves in various courts. So we have quite a number of unrepresented litigants, women who present their cases, for example, in the children's court with various issues around child support, child maintenance, access to children. The children's court, as it is not operational in that sort of way. And it has the highest number of unrepresented litigants. These are people coming from far-flung areas, or even if you just go next door, Kibera, Madare, and such areas where we represent, or even deep inside Isiolo, wherever it might be, where the very rural woman is coming from, how do they have access to virtual platforms? These people are now at a point where they're thinking about bread and butter issues. How do they think about accessing justice through Zoom? We are also dealing with illiteracy, not just basic education, but also digital literacy challenges that are presenting. I have, for example, a number of cases that I would like to bring to the fore. I have a lady, let's call her Wanjiku. who has a matter in Kajiado Court. She has had her divorce finalized. She was waiting to have a hearing on the division of matrimonial property. Her case has taken 6 years in court, and all that time she has been living in a single room, waiting for the division of the matrimonial property so that she can have a life of her own to start from scratch. That has been impeded by COVID. She cannot access court. She is an elderly woman around 65 years. How do we help her around digital access to courts? I have in mind 2 separate succession causes, where one is a widow in a contest with her brothers-in-law over her deceased husband's property, which she is depending on to continue the livelihood of her children. There is another who is a daughter joined in a battle with her brothers to get a share of her deceased father's estate, and that is her only hope of reprieve from an abusive marriage. That is the only way she sees herself getting out of an abusive marriage. We also have very many perpetrators and aggressors who have used COVID as a curtain to hide behind and continue their violations. There are a raft of human rights violations currently going on, but this has given space and emboldening perpetrators of especially gender-based violence cases. You will find police have been turning away victims of who go to report domestic violence and other cases, saying they do not have space to lock up perpetrators. They have in fact been instructed to reduce the number of people they hold in their cells. You will also find that many people are afraid to report. For example, there is an area around Limuru where they are in an island enclosed by road gates. They cannot go over either to Kikuyu police station or Tigoni police station because there are roadblocks all over. So those people are in sort of an island and cut off from any access to law enforcement or access to justice because they cannot even access physically the court, even if they were to attempt to go there. What this has presented is some parties resorting to different dispute resolution mechanisms. Victims get turned away and are told domestic violence is a domestic issue, is a family issue. Go and solve it at the dispute level. So you're sending back the victim and the perpetrator in the same environment where they're being abused. Why can't we come up with a system? I mean, we were able to find quarantine facilities. Can't these perpetrators have their own quarantine facility and stay there at their own cost while the women and children are being kept away? You realize most children have closed schools, and statistics show that most perpetrators of sexual violence against children are people known to them. These are relatives, they are people they stay with in the house, stepfathers, stepmothers, cousins, elder uncles, elder siblings even. These children are stuck with those people in the house. Where will that child report to? Who will have access to them when they need the access to justice services that they can? So sometimes, well, the courts are open and we will be told that the criminal courts are having hearings where the plea is being taken. That's fine. The perpetrator will be arraigned in court and they will plead not guilty. What will the court do? It will most likely set bail terms that are reasonable, well, within their constitutional right, but at a lower scale this time because there's an effort to decongest detention facilities. So you will find the perpetrator will be sent back to the same community where he has come from to intimidate, threaten witnesses and victims. So what is the future of that case that we are trying to build? Will, after the perpetrator has been allowed to intimidate witnesses, what then will be the future of the case that you're trying to prosecute. We also have very many cases of sexual violence involving children, which had been set down for hearing during the April holidays when the children had closed school. These are mostly children whose parents are also vulnerable and marginalized. Now, we keep getting questions. When will we go back to court? When will the ongoing case be had? So those ongoing cases, the backlog keeps pushing. Remember, these are cases that have been in court for a significant length of time before they got an allocation of an April hearing date. So the vulnerable and marginalized have totally been left behind in this. And I can see someone asking if you're taking advantage of the Protection Against Domestic Violence Act and the protections that are therein in the act, you realize to get a restraining order, you would have to go through the court system. We had one case where we had already filed for a restraining order and a protection order for the client just before COVID began. And we were at a point where the court had not certified the matter urgent and we had been told to serve. Then movement has been restricted. So will the court be considering such instances and the restriction of movement to issue restraining orders considering the circumstances of COVID?
Right. Thank you so much, Beatrice, and thank you for shedding light into, some of the struggles that vulnerable persons and marginalized persons are facing, especially during COVID-19. Judge Majanja, let me come to you and, just listening to what Dawn has said, listening to what Beatrice has said in terms of access to justice needs, and bearing in mind that access to justice needs have heightened now with COVID-19 and the restrictions and interventions that, have attempted to be put in place. Now more than ever, during this pandemic, the citizens have needed the courts to remain open. I know the judiciary had, has come a journey, first beginning with, reducing the activities within the court and then reopening the courts with the processes through the NCAJ letter. So, let us know, try and help us understand what are the things that the judiciary has done, what are the steps that the judiciary is taking to ensure that when Wanjiku, and I see one of our participants has asked us to define who Wanjiku is, just in case somebody doesn't know who Wanjiku is. And we use Wanjiku loosely to mean an ordinary person. So it's not engendered to mean female, but of course, understanding also that the access to justice burden is heavily placed on women more than men, with the evidence that we have had along the way. But Judge, let us know, what has the judiciary done to ensure that the ordinary person can access justice during this time?
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank ICJ for providing this forum at this particular time to engender dialogue on access to justice. I think it's important that we talk to one another because access to justice is not a task for one institution. That said, also before I proceed, I just want to recognize that many people who have contributed and continue to contribute to access to justice: judges, magistrates, judicial staff, advocates, prosecutors, state councils, police officers, all who go to work together to ensure that justice continues even through this difficult time. Before I just get on to the subject matter, I just want to stipulate certain things. First, COVID is something most of us or all of us right now have never seen before. No one planned for it. It came, in a manner of speaking, suddenly, and we had to use what we call a precautionary approach to how we deliver justice. And that is why on 16th, we had to scale down operations. And I use the word scale down deliberately because there has been an impression created that the courts closed down. The fact is that the courts never closed down. The courts were alive to the fact that this pandemic has come and we need to respond to it in the manner that takes care of the interests of our staff and members of the public in light of the challenges caused by the COVID pandemic. That said, I think the reaction of the judiciary was, I would say, governed by three broad principles. I think first is the government directives on who is to work, that people should work from home. Secondly, that even if we were to work, we have to work within the Ministry of Health guidelines, because the government policy really is containment of this virus. And that is why initially we were told to work from home, and the focus was really deal with what could be done at that point. So that between 15th of March and about mid-April, the focus was on delivering judgments, working on judgments that were due. And, you know, judgments are not, I wouldn't say, people look at them and say, okay, you were just delivering judgments, but judgments are the work products of any judicial officer. The courts were also engaged in a very important activity of decongesting prisons. I think sometimes we forget that people in prison, people in remand are vulnerable people. And from what the scientific, from what the facts that emerge is that, in fact, the prisons and the remands are the, you know, they have a potential of spreading the COVID virus very, very rapidly. So between that time, we have revised sentences, we have revised bail terms, and a substantial number of people in prison have been released. Because of the nature of our work, we were forced to leverage on technology. And the reason why we leverage on technology is that it was the best way to be able to deal with this situation. But again, one thing we need to recognize is that over the years, there has been very little investment in the judiciary. And you recall that even before this pandemic, the last substantial issue the judiciary had to deal with were budget cuts. And the technology budget had been severely affected, and the investment in that area, of course, governs what we have now as the response. So we were forced to leverage on technology, and doing the best we can, we have been unable to mount online hearings all over the country. And one thing that has been consistent is, first of all, we've been able to deal with the people in prison. We have been conducting criminal appeals. We have been conducting pleas. We have been dealing with revisions. And that is not to say that physical hearings have not been going on. Actually, they have been going on when it is necessary and when justice demands. And from what I know is that no one has been sent away from court when it is necessary that they be heard. So all over the country, our courts are open, our judges and magistrates are working, and if and when it is necessary to hear matters, they're available. However, we have been facing very serious challenges even in terms of delivery of justice. Firstly, we know that access to courts has been severely restricted in terms of physical attendance. And this is just because we're in this situation where, first of all, we have the curfew, we have restrictions on movement, we have difficulties in people moving from one place to another. So we have had to postpone all urgent and non-urgent hearings, the normal day-to-day hearings. There have been concerns about remote justice, this justice that people will say is conducted on Zoom. and implications on the right to a fair trial. So whereas we would like to do that, this is something we have to think through, not only ourselves, but with our stakeholders. The third issue is, even as we do these online court sessions, there is the issue of adequate facilities, either in the courts or in remand or outside with our stakeholders we engage with in terms of quality video conferencing facilities. It's an issue that we also need to deal with, even if we are to upscale reliance on technology and increase investment. There is also a very important issue that we have encountered. There has been unwillingness by many lawyers, by litigants, to accommodate and embrace technology in order to ensure that court processes are running. And this has been very, very acute, particularly in certain civil cases where what we are told is that lawyers have not been paid and therefore they cannot go on with their matters, even if we put them on the technology platform. So that again is an issue we have to deal with. Issues of connectivity in many parts of the country. And again, and I agree with Don there, that really insisting on online platforms is an issue of serious access to justice for those who are indigent, who are underrepresented, and it is something we have to deal with. Then, of course, even if you say you are going to hear matters, as I said, you have to deal with government directives on movement. Like one of the issues we have to contend with, even if we were to say that we want to proceed with succession cases, most of the people who are involved in succession cases are old, they come from far distances, and we have to find a way to accommodate them, particularly in terms of protecting them and their health and protecting the health of the others. Then, of course, we are always aware that even as we go through this process, ultimately we'll have serious backlog at the end of the day, which may further impede access to justice, and we have to start thinking about how to avoid that eventuality. That said, we have done a lot, and I just want to mention a few things. For example, the Supreme Court is now entirely online, and that is for good reason. The Supreme Court has a few judges. Most of them are beyond that age where they can work with other people because they are vulnerable. But also one has to realize that if one judge is affected, then the whole court has to go into lockdown. And that also goes for the Court of Appeal. But I'm happy to say for the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeal, all of them are proceeding with their work normally. The Court of Appeal is conducting hearings, and in fact, conducting hearings in all the court stations. They're up to date in their decisions. And they took a deliberate step to hear criminal appeals of unrepresented litigants during the month of April. And many people either have been released or have had their cases cleared. In the High Court, in the Environment and Labor Relations Court, and the ELC, Land and Environment, the matters are proceeding. But again, each of the cases present a different typology of cases. For example, in the Commercial Division in Nairobi, where we have very few unrepresented people, the challenge is, of course, how we adopt the technology. But in cases, for example, you have murder cases, you have a problem. Even if you want to hear the case, the police have to go out, look for the witnesses, bring them, and one has to take into account the health regulations that are prevailing that make it difficult to hear cases. The magistrates are also working. They are taking pleas, they are hearing certain criminal cases. In fact, I would like to mention that I think at the Chief Magistrate's Court, Nairobi, they have made a deliberate effort to proceed with cases of defilement. And from this month, they will be proceeding with them and making arrangements to hear them either physically or online platforms, depending on the circumstances. So that one is being done, and it will be rolled over the country. The Children's Court is also hearing cases physically, because of the nature of those cases. We also have tribunals. The Rent Restriction Tribunal is also hearing cases, and they're making arrangements to take cases, particularly where we are hearing there are many, many evictions. They are very active in that area. So I think the judiciary is responding, but of course, we are hampered by the nature of the technology and the circumstances which we find ourselves in. Access to justice has always been a problem in this country. It is not a new thing. Over the last 15, 20 years, the judiciary has been investing substantially in improving access to justice. Of course, the COVID presents a particular challenge. And what I would like to say is that we do not have a monopoly over ideas on how to improve access to justice. What we need is cooperation of all our stakeholders to ensure that Wanjiku is well served. So thank you very much. I'll be happy to hear other interventions and elaborate further. Just one more issue. We had also invested a lot in mediation. We have now started getting requests for virtual mediation. It is working. I would like to say as of yesterday, we had 58 referrals. 8 cases have already been settled virtually, and we are still exploring on how to roll that out given the circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judge. And we'll come back to that, mediation and other justice systems in just a bit. But before I let you go, Judge, we saw the Chief Justice speak publicly and say, the budget for the judiciary has been cut. It's small. It's not able to meet the needs of the judiciary. So for it to offer justice services to the people, and that was before COVID-19. So COVID-19 has presented an even greater challenge for the judiciary. So I'm just wondering, has the judiciary had an opportunity to review its budget, to present this budget, and especially because we see the national government coming up with the funds, emergency funds to deal with COVID-19? Has access to justice been one of those issues that the government is particularly interested in funding using this emergency fund?
Yes, I would say that in our budget proposals for the financial year 2020-2021, we proposed substantially an increase in the budgets that go to the component of access to justice. This includes technology, investing more in technology, investing in facilities, increasing the budget for mediation, also increasing the budget for pro bono services. I think let's not forget that it's very, very key in terms of creating intermediaries between those who are unrepresented and indigent and the court system. So we have made those proposals. We hope they'll be accepted. Some of these issues, for example, let me just give you an example. Technology is an enabler of justice. So even where we are saying that Wanjiku may not have the wherewithal, I think it's important for us to realize that we can use technology to improve that access. For example, when we are talking about the woman, say in Moranga, who has to come for her succession case with her brothers in Nairobi, for example, it would be nice, for example, in every court station or in particular areas to have a virtual hearing room where they can go to and be their evidence taken so that they don't have to travel to Nairobi. But those kind of facilities, of course, require money to put up. So we have to think about, even when we think about technology, it's not that we are saying technology is an end in itself. It is an enabler of justice. It is one of the things that will facilitate this access to justice. Because as it is, even when we say we have physical facilities, good courts, we are building courts everywhere, people still have to come to those courts. So we are looking at all that to see how we can improve that access.
All right, thank you so much, Judge. Please remember to continue typing in your questions We'll look at the questions. My colleague Silas will analyze those questions in just a bit. So keep them coming, comments. We appreciate those who are sending them already and those who are tuned in. Let's pick up from where Judge left in terms of court annex mediation. And I come to you, Dr. Musumba. You've interacted with several justice mechanisms that are provided under the Constitution. COVID-19, is it time that we now start appreciating this other justice systems? Because I think we've been slow in terms of appreciating and incorporating them in terms of systems that the ordinary person can use. So does COVID-19 present us with that opportunity to appreciate them and use this? Is it something that is accessible, available, viable for Wanjiku to use? Yeah. What are your thoughts around that?
Thank you very much to ICJ for this opportunity to be able to share my views on this matter. I've just had a quick look at the number of participants in this forum. We're looking at about 300 people gathered in one forum to be able to interact with the justice issues on the question. People are entering webinars in Russia, France, and all over the place. So on the one hand, Corona has taught us that we can actually continue to have discourses online and that are not actually confined by space, geography, or anything. So thank you for this opportunity. I salute my colleagues in this panel, my senior, Dawn, Justice Majanja, my peer, and our dear younger colleague, Beatrice. And now going to the issues that you've asked me. First, I'd like to say that the advent of the coronavirus and its impact on the judiciary, it has actually only shown the stresses that are experienced in the formal justice mechanism sphere. For the simple reason that there's a research that was done over 10 years ago that shows that over 90% of Kenyans access justice in the informal spheres. Therefore, and of course, you know, our population has gone up and we need current research, of course, being in Kipra has taught me that we have to be able to come up with evidence-based solutions. So we need a further research to be able to determine today whether the percentage remains at over 90%, or whether there has been any shift. So that percentage of people, corona or no corona, has been accessing justice. Disputes at the border stage with border vehicles, border borders are still being resolved. Disputes in our villages at the watering holes are still being resolved. Disputes between individuals in our villages and in other spheres are still being resolved, corona or no corona. So I would like to, I'd like us all to be able to place in context that the problem that is being experienced in the formal justice system, when you take into account the number of people who actually access justice in that system versus those who access in the informal sphere, those who access in the informal sphere are actually many, many more. I'd also like to point out that the informal sphere, which of course justice in that sphere is largely based on the enduring strength of culture, where we rely on elders or we rely on persons that we have identified. Because you see, when you're looking at, let's say, the border sector, people from different ethnic communities, different dispositions come together, but then they do decide among themselves to be able to give one individual or two individuals, whatever structure they come up with, to be able to be subservient to those people so they can lead them. So if you can be able to think about that enduring nature of culture, or those are the systems that are actually assisting people to be able to access justice, then that tells you that we need to do a lot more to be able to determine the nature of justice dispensed in these systems. Because if you look at Article 159 2C, that actually constitutionally mandates the courts to be able to have reference to traditional methods or to traditional dispute resolution sites, you can see that this is something that is actually quite current and needs to actually be taken into account today, except that you have to ask yourself the question, whether the justice that is accessed within these informal spheres meets the constitutional criteria. I'll give you an example. When it comes to, of course, our traditional norms and systems, they are generally patriarchal. Of course, men have the upper hand. So where you have a situation where elders are predominantly male, making decisions over these issues, you'll find that in domestic violence cases, then a woman actually stands very disadvantaged. If you're looking at sexual and gender-based violence cases, then women would generally be disadvantaged, as well as succession, where, of course, in many situations, the man is the one who has the preeminence in terms of inheriting things from their parents. So the question would be, these systems of justice that are informal, one has to be able to scrutinize and be able to see to what extent can they actually be upgraded or be used. Remember that they have the capacity to interrupt even the formal justice systems. We have seen time and time again the informal sector affecting the formal sector. We have had cases in court that have collapsed, murder cases, domestic violence cases, cases involving children that have collapsed because of lack of witnesses. Why? Because the issues have been resolved quietly. They've been resolved quietly in the community. We've seen cases where people have impregnated young girls, and when the matter is taken to court and they are actually arrested, you see the family of the girl coming to ask that the case is taken out. Why? Because they've already been settled. Because the man who impregnated this lady said he's going to pay the school fees of this girl as well as the young child. So the informal justice arena clearly cannot be able to resolve many of these, some of these cases. It may be easy to resolve some, but not all. So the question would be, can we have a blend where, for example, the formal justice system is able to upgrade certain parts of the informal system so that it is actually usable? Do we have those places or those sections where it will not work, and therefore you want to be able to influence the informal and make sure that it actually works well? I'd like to point out that, of course, I think we're all aware that in Rwanda, they use the Gashasha courts to be able to address the question of genocide. Now, if an issue such as the cold-blooded murder of many people can be resolved sitting on reeds, where the formal justice system came up with a methodology and then was able to say that we can deal with these cases in this way, these ones in this way, people who meet this criteria can be let go, these people who meet this criteria have to be jailed, then I'm sure that those two systems working well together can be able to come up with a solution. Of course, I have to mention here that the judiciary has taken a lead on this by coming up with the task force that is led by Professor Joel Ngugi on alternative justice systems to be able to look at this issue and find out how these two can work well together. So in my view, a rule book that would be developed by the judiciary to be able to allow the informal justice system to be able to be guided by certain things would be useful. But remember, again, with my background at Kipra, I would like to say that, it's easy to be able to bandy solutions and say, we think they should work in this way or in that way. It's very important that the research is done. People need to be interviewed at the grassroots level to be able to find out what their notions of justice are. Because you can be trying to resolve this problem when in fact the problem is actually not what you think it is, which means that evidence-based research is required to be undertaken so that people can be able to, you can understand what are the notions of justice that people predominantly have. And therefore, if you're going to be able to try to do a blend between the formal and the informal, how can you achieve that? I think lately also, we now have the small claims courts that have been, that I think the amendment was signed the other day. So hopefully, maybe anytime soon that can also come up. That will help. Courts that have been stepped down, that don't have, the kind of procedures and things that we see in courts generally, and which ordinary persons who are not lawyers can be able to express themselves simply and be able to walk out of court with a judgment that they're satisfied with. I'd also like to say, as I come to conclude, that it would also be useful if decisions that are arrived at in the informal sphere could be registered, could be put in a registry in the formal system, so that if we agreed with you to resolve this matter in this way, and then we deposit that decision, let's say at a registry of the formal justice system, that would help. So I just want to reiterate that as COVID has affected the formal justice sphere, In the informal justice sphere, I would say that people are continuing to do things as they have, of course, taking into account the restrictions in movement. So I would say that it would be useful for the judiciary, for Kenyans generally, for organizations like ICJ and others that are involved in the justice sector to be able to undertake research on the ground that would be able to give you figures for how people are accessing justice. Are they satisfied when elders sit down and are able to do, to interview both parties? Are people satisfied with that? So I think that if we are able to pay that attention to the sector that actually enables resolution of the majority of disputes in this country, then we'd be able to have a win-win situation on both sides. Thank you.
Thank you, Daktari, so much for that. Perhaps we can, just before I go to the next session, just to thank all of us who are participating in this particular webinar. Just to mention also that we were live on KTN News, courtesy of KTN News. Thank you so much, KTN. We have seen a lot of questions come up with about 300 people on Zoom and many others on YouTube and also on Twitter. Questions have been asked, for example, by Mr. Lewis Kamau, saying that Justice Majanja, how there was the issue of the swearing in of judges the last year that came out, and these judges are not yet in the system. How do you see this as affecting the common mwananchi during this pandemic? Other questions to you panelists, how effective is the court annexed mediation effective in this period, especially in the COVID-19 pandemic? And then what about child maintenance? And I think that would go to Beatrice. What about child maintenance during this time of COVID? And I know that Dr. Musumba, you were very, one of your very favorite persons was Okoth Ogendo, I know, and he talked about a constitution without constitutionalism. And there's a question here that has been posed, people asking that recently you can even see that government officials are not putting on their masks, even in public. You can see that people are not following the law. What is the problem that exists? And maybe you can use that and maybe shed some more light on that. But just before we go to the other questions, I can see that there was a hand that was raised. There was a hand that was raised, but I think it has been lowered. Maybe I can give you a minute or two before we ask more questions, those questions that we've asked.
Yes, I think one of the questions was directed to me about swearing in of judges. All I'd like to say is this, that that is the responsibility of the president. The court has already made a decision, and that issue will be dealt with at that stage. But that said, of course, we are always, any country, in fact, it's a well-known issue. We will never get enough judges, we will never get enough judicial officers, and that's why it's important to utilize these alternative justice systems so that we reduce pressure from the courts. Just an issue on maintenance of children. I think this is a huge challenge. And I think I would ask those who deal with the issue of children to start thinking of how we can have a system where collection of maintenance as exists in other countries is not dependent on the parties themselves. That is one thing we have to start thinking about in terms of removing enforcement. Put it, for example, in the children's department, where they're the ones who collect the money and pay over, because that removes the burden from an already vulnerable party. But the way the system works right now is that it is the parties themselves who go and enforce the order. So, for example, if you're if you have a judgment in your favor right now, you are this lady and you're collecting maintenance, you can imagine trying to instruct an auctioneer to go and execute that. Again, presents a huge problem. So this is one of the things we have to start thinking about. And then lastly, and something which I didn't mention, in terms of the judiciary response to all the COVID issues, one of the things that I would like to emphasize is the centrality of court users committees all over the country, because court users committee comprise of key stakeholders in the administration of justice, advocates, government bodies, non-governmental bodies that are able to design local specific solutions to local problems of access to justice. And all over the country, as we speak right now, each court users committee has found innovative ways, very innovative ways to deal with the problem of access to justice. I would like to mention, for example, Eldoret High Court has had a very good engagement with their court users, and their court users are now able to access the courts in their own unique way in terms of doing matters. So I'd urge the advocates, I'd urge our stakeholders to really engage with the court users committees, because those ones, because they respond to local issues, they're able to deal with the particular problems facing particular communities in terms of access to justice. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Judge, for that. I'm sure we'll come back to you in a few minutes, but I can give the other panelists a minute to quickly answer, and then we can pick someone from the participants who are taking from the participants. So maybe Dr. Musumba, you can highlight a bit, and then we can pick someone.
Thank you, Silas, for the question that you have raised, which is somebody is asking why government officers are not compliant with respect to wearing their masks, and drawing reference to the late Hastings Okoth Ogendo's Constitutions Without Constitutionalism. I'm going to try my best not to go into lecture mode and proceed with what, of course, the late professor was very eloquent and erudite at. Just to say that this is really about the culture of obedience to law. And of course, Okoth Ogendo—
The question was directed to me about swearing in. Is that that is the responsibility of the president.
Sorry, that was an interruption. Please go ahead, Dr.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I was saying that the whole idea about people wearing or not wearing masks, it's not only government officials, but it's, I think, in the general population, although I note that the two of you are compliant, given that I can see that you do have your masks below your chins. Not recommended, though. It should be covering your nose. So this is about a culture of obedience to law. And I think what Okoth Ogendo was saying at the time following independence is still something we see today, where we ourselves are the ones who, people argued before that people did not feel the other constitution, the 1963 constitution, because they were not there when they made it. We went through an elaborate process of making the 2010 constitution. So we can argue that we are the ones who gave ourselves this law, but we are still the same ones who, on several occasions, do not obey it. So this is really a culture that needs to be nurtured, and now maybe ICJ and others can have ideas about how to socially re-engineer people to be able to respect the constitution and laws. Thank you.
Thank you, Daktari. And now maybe we can pick someone from the participants. Ibrahim Oduor, are you there? Ibrahim?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
My question is brief, and it goes to Honorable Justice.
Go ahead, Ibrahim.
Yeah, what I'm trying to ask is that during this time, mostly the judiciary has adopted the use of technology. Basically, we are doing filings using technology. We are attending court using Zoom and all the other online video software. But there is a challenge that the process is too slow. My question really was, what is the judiciary's strategy to making sure that the process, can be hastened? Because you find that people file documents, and it takes 2-3 days before some matters that are filed under urgency to be placed before the judges. And before that back and forth is done, there is a lapse of time that generally occasions delay in justice. And still on that question, what is the judiciary strategy of engaging stakeholders, the law society, and all that to improve the system so that it's not used just within this period, but also post coronavirus period? And I ask this because the judge also happens to sit in the JSC, which then is very fundamental in implementing these strategies. That's all.
Thank you very much. Ibrahim, perhaps we can take another question.
From Jacqueline Ngutia, are you there? Can you hear us?
Jacqueline, are you there? All right.
There you
Good
are.
afternoon.
Good afternoon. How are you?
I'm okay. Nice to see you all, Justice Majanja, Dea, and everyone. I'm Jacqueline Nguti. I work with the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. I first of all must commend the judiciary for coming up with the prison decongestion program, because recently the UN CAT developed an optional protocol on torture, and one of the recommendations they had given was use of prison decongestion and swifter bail terms. My question would be to Justice Majanja on the criteria the judiciary is using for the decongestion program, and whether you have looked in the Power of Mercy. I know it's independent, but how can you work with the Power of Mercy Committee for a more comprehensive program? And then the more comprehensive prison decongestion program. The second question would be on matters involving persons deprived of liberty who are in custody, especially those that were they were at a very near end in terms of judgment, rulings, or just hearings. What arrangement can be made so that their matters are fast-tracked, because we've received quite a number of complaints from those inmates? And on access to information, which Dea had also raised, we have situations where the judiciary was having the mobile courts, far-flung areas. So how do we ensure that those persons are aware of the current judiciary plans to enhancing justice during COVID-19? And is it possible for the judiciary then to work with other partners? I'll give an example of the county government. If the county government would provide facilities where litigants can then reach out to the judiciary using those forums. And lastly, this is just a general concern that I've noticed, that we are trying to work on prison decongestion, yet the other place we really need to look out for is at the police stations. Right now, the police remands are quite full and they're overwhelmed. What will be the best way to deal with that situation? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. So perhaps Silas can read more questions, and then we can have our panelists answer, and we can take another round of questions. Silas?
Great. There are some questions here which I've attempted to analyze to Justice Majanja. Question from Anthony Kimani. What has the judiciary put in terms of cybersecurity measures, now that, having in mind that we are now using technology to both do undertake communication and also try to automate some of these processes? What are some of the cybersecurity measures that have been put in place to ensure that some of these orders, rulings, judgments are authentic, to avoid hacking, etc.? And then also the challenge of electronic evidence. How is the court going to handle this evidence given electronically? And then there's another question to Dawn. How best will other stakeholders contribute in terms of sensitization and public participation? What do you feel like the role of other actors like civil society, etc.? And then to Justice as well. I can see most questions are going to Judge. What exactly is the impact of COVID-19 on the enforcement of judicial decisions without delay? You can see that, and one case in point is the issue of the demolitions of the houses down in Kariobangi South, authorities went ahead to actually demolish houses, and there was an existing order by Justice Okongo. What is the impact of COVID-19 on enforcement of these decisions? And then also to, maybe I can direct this to Dr. Musumba. What is the difference between using technology to enhance communication between court users and the court itself, and using technology to actually digitize court processes? Maybe you want to address that. Maybe I can give everyone some few minutes to answer those questions before we pick other questions. I can see that there are people who have raised their hands, and yeah, maybe we can start with Beatrice. I think I'd asked a question about issues of children.
Thank you, Silas, and thank you to my senior colleagues for their very insightful contributions. While I sit here, I keep feeling very worried that we are taking away the conversation from Wanjiku. You realize that technology is still quite a luxury for Wanjiku. This is a person who is asking themselves, which meal will I provide for my children? They don't have access to data bundles. They don't have access to even a phone that is tech savvy. This is a person who has been playing catch up in access to justice under Article 48, even previously before COVID. So how are we centering them in this conversation and how they will catch up? Let's also be careful about bringing in informal justice systems into the realm where they do not belong, especially with gender-based violence, because it's a very confusing time for our communities, and that is very likely to happen. I did mention earlier how police have been turning away victims of domestic violence, and then what this then does is to encourage the informal systems to come into place, and also how we are going around communication of the ideas that are coming forth. People who have access to technology, for example, who are listening into the webinar, are able to see what the judiciary is doing. But how about that person who is down there, mashinani, down there in the grassroots? Are they able to access this information? For example, what Justice Majanja just shared on how courts are beginning to go about sexual offenses cases with regard to children. How do they access that sort of information to enable them continue accessing justice? As was raised, the issue of children is becoming very sticky even for us, and not just in terms of maintenance. You realize there is also the issue of access to children, where sometimes the child is with one parent and the other time the child is with the other parent, and usually it's regulated by court. I completely agree when Justice Majanja says we have to find a way to enforce child support devoid of the court, because litigants are always going back to court to enforce judgments. But for some time, you realize that even the Department of Children's Services had been closed. So even where a litigant is aggrieved on by a party who is not complying with a court order, where do they go to for enforcement? And you realize mostly they have not been certified as urgent because they're not new cases, and they will be told, actually, which is true, every case in the children's court is urgent. So how do we go about this? The children's court is a flurry of activity usually, but COVID is presenting much more bigger challenges. You realize, for example, if a parent had been assigned to take care of school fees, and now children are not in school, but they need additional support in terms of food and other household items, there will be very many contestations on that area. And usually the person with privilege is one who will trample upon the rights of the oppressed and will use COVID as a tool to continue the oppression, indignity, and injustice upon the victim.
You are done.
Okay, sorry. I think I kind of missed what you may have said, but I'll just go with what you said before. For some second, my audio was not working. I think a major question that you've asked is how can civil society organizations, and again, I like the term civil society writ large, not reduced to NGOs. How can civil society organizations and also other citizens be more proactive, and how can they be enabled to get into law and policy making as we deal with COVID-19 and as we look for a new normal post-COVID-19? As we say, the day after COVID-19, will we go back to the old ways of doing things, or we will have new ways of doing things? I think we can be more proactive, and there are actually some good examples, part of which I've given on the text. As I said, Lawyers Hub has been co-creating, getting teams of lawyers to work together in what they call legal hackathons, to come up with draft laws and regulations, within a very short time, because many people are contributing together, and then presenting governments with a draft bill, which then they can easily use for legislation, sorry. I think we can have more of that. I've also indicated that, for instance, the University of Nairobi has come up with something very good, a multidisciplinary team of scholars drawn from different schools, different faculties, different disciplines, working together on the medical and scientific parts of the crisis that we're dealing with, but even on other parts of the crisis, taking care of the vulnerable, reaching out into the communities, especially the high density communities, carrying evidence-based and empirical research on how they would like to be served or had during the crisis, and making sure that this is put forward. So we have examples like that. We have examples like KELIN, the Kenyan Ethical Legal Network on HIV and AIDS, which, working together with its colleagues, has come up with very comprehensive rights-based approaches to managing various aspects of the crisis. Uraia innovated a citizen participation dashboard very early. The Kenya Human Rights Commission has actually organized, and working mostly on phone and on WhatsApp, a team of pro bono lawyers who are willing to provide representation for those that have fallen victim during the COVID-19 crisis, especially victims of police brutality, victims of police corruption, and victims of the mismanagement and misuse of the quarantining facilities. I could say the same about the Muslims for Human Rights, Muhuri, especially at the coast, the Tanzania Human Rights Defenders Coalition here in Tanzania, the Human Rights Awareness and Promotion Forum in Uganda. And I think really what we should learn to do is to speak to people rather than speak for them. In Kenya, we have the working network of the social justice centers, and I think they're a very strong starting point for providing very practical ideas on how government and citizens and so on can collaborate to make sure that we have measures that actually make sense and that take care of the most vulnerable and the minorities within our communities. I think some emerging good practices seems to be the sector-wide approaches, as we say, at the national level, the National Council for the Administration of Justice and its equivalent in the other countries in the region, where you bring together all the key actors in the chain of administration of justice so that they make decisions together with everybody's views on board. I would just like to highlight also the point that has been made by the Honorable Mr. Justice David Majanja, that we devolve that down to the local court level. Each individual court, each individual judicial tribunal or quasi-judicial tribunal. The court uses committees, or what we used to call the bar bench committees at the local level, where they can come up with measures that are uniquely situated and uniquely responding to how they're dealing with an issue at the local level. That also allows for local innovation. I think, for instance, I've seen some suggestions around having apps, an app that can help, for instance, with automatically assessing what should be the right court filing fee to be paid for a particular service. Apps that can help, for instance, if you pay by M-Pesa, to be able to link very quickly the M-Pesa payment that you've paid with the relevant court file, so that things can go quicker. I think this will come faster out of local innovations, court by court basis, rather than waiting for an institution-wide directive or decision or new way of doing things that will come from central government or from the apex of the judiciary. Two more points I would like to make, because I see a couple of colleagues, especially young colleagues, have said, but will this new way of doing things leave us out, especially the young lawyers? And somebody has asked whether ADR, alternative dispute resolution, is now limited to the court-annexed mediation only. And I would say no. Other elements of alternative dispute resolution are also open and they're going on. I think Dr. Linda Musumba has spoken about mainly the informal justice systems. There's still arbitration, mediation, facilitation, conciliation. And in fact, what I think is needed is to build the appetite, especially among the legal profession and the citizens, that these systems can work side by side with the formal court system. So I would just urge colleagues at the leadership of LSK, ICJ Kenya, and others to see how we can provide capacity building and also guidelines for our members, especially our younger members, on how to make these areas, ADR, to be sustainable legal practice areas. The same thing with the small claims courts, which Dr. Linda Musumba also mentioned. And again, I know there have been some reservations with things that people felt could have been done better in that regime. I would venture to suggest that a small claims court, including adjudication, full-time and part-time, can provide a very useful occupation, especially for our younger colleagues at the bar, and we should approach it as such and see how we can offer capacity building and also guidelines that then make these areas where sustainably legal professionals and other ADI professionals can earn a living while doing good to the public. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. Quickly, maybe we can give Daktari a minute.
Thank you, Silas and colleagues. I'd like to address, an issue that was raised by my colleague Beatrice, a fear that she has expressed about, discussing the issue of informal justice systems in the context of sexual and gender-based violence cases. I just want to say that despite that fear, the fact is, and the fact remains, that the majority of these cases don't come to court. So that if what we were discussing today was about the sexual and gender-based violence cases that are in court or within the formal sphere, then yes, we could be able to then discuss those issues in that context. But the fact remains that the larger percentage, and in my work in a civil society organization, I encountered the reality that the majority of people do not report domestic violence. Majority of people, let's say incest being a very prevalent sort of thing that happens in some communities around the country, most of those cases do not end up in court. So I would say that, for Beatrice and who's in crew, as well as other organizations dealing with this, it would be very, very important to be able to find out the extent to which this is a problem, so that then you're part of the solution for being able to see how to be able to make the informal sector be responsive to cases like these ones. That's what I would say. Then coming to the question you asked me, Silas, about technology. Okay, for me, I draw, I look at it in two ways. One, we can use technology in the way that the judiciary has come up today, to be able to use it to communicate, to convey, to be able to interact the way we are interacting right now in this webinar, in these forums and spheres to be able to talk. But I would go much further and say that there are so many jurisdictions, I'm sure that Justice Majanja and the judiciary are aware of them, which actually enable the digital building of a case. What do I mean by digitally building a case? I mean that in the same way that when we're applying for our passports on the immigration website, we are asked to fill in our information, we upload our pictures, we do all this, and then we print that. once we print that, that form comprises all information. So in the same way as is done in some other jurisdictions, you're looking at a situation where when the police are able to apprehend someone, that OB digital, I mean, we should have a sphere within the judiciary, a system, a web-based system, where the police are able to then, load that OB onto that system. That system then generates to all the concerned parties a message for them to do their part, so that within 1 week, you have an entire case that has actually been digitally built onto that system. I've seen this working in other jurisdictions, but like I said, I'm sure the judiciary has seen this even better than I have. So that at the end of the day, the amount of time it takes for people to come to court for mentions to see whether someone has complied with something they've been asked to, whether this and that document has been filed, if all these things could be put on a web-based system, where by the time, if it is necessary at all, for people to have face-to-face engagement, then it can take place. But what if people are prepared to plead guilty? What if people are prepared to, through that system, be able to reach, some agreements which don't require us to come to court? This means that the backlog that is created by the need for us to come to a physical space and have these interactions would be reduced significantly. And therefore, the access to justice that we're talking about, which in many cases is hindered by the fact that my case is filed today, it is listened to in 3 years' time or 4 years' time. There's no justice there. I mean, there are people who die in between these situations. So I'm not an IT expert. I'm sure that there are those who can, our country has no end to the people who can be able to come up with systems, web-based systems and apps and all of them to be able to enable us to avoid, going to court unless we need to. And if at all we have to go to court, by the time we go there, so many other issues have been dispensed with, and judges can in their chambers, in some cases, be able to pass judgment without having to come to court. So I know, of course, these are touchy areas, of course, for advocates, because then they feel that what is actually their job may be taken away, but people will still need this. So one has to then ask themselves, in Western jurisdictions where this is used, what are solicitors and barristers doing when in fact these systems are actually in place? So I feel it's that as we change, the work for advocates will also change. And I think that there'll still be a lot of work for us to do in the coming days, even with these changes as they come along. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daktari. And now to Judge. And just before you address some of these questions, there's just one more thing from Honorable Millie Odhiambo asking, what is the judiciary doing in terms of tracking and monitoring judgments that fall below international standards? Judge, are you there?
Kindly unmute.
Yes.
Thank you. Go ahead, Judge.
Yes.
Thank you.
I have many questions to answer, but that again is a testimony to the fact that this is one of the forums where we have to disseminate information. Just again, listening to Beatrice, we should never lose focus of the problems Wanjiku is facing in terms of access to justice. And even as we emphasize technology, I kept saying that technology is an enabler of justice. And to be able to leverage on technology, I think all stakeholders must have that discussion, because in terms of access, the judiciary is only one player. And the purpose of this kind of engagements is to identify those problems and probably seek solutions for them. The judiciary does not say it has all the solutions to all the problems that Wanjiku is facing, but at least we are willing to engage with our stakeholders through all the forums. Let's say, let me first deal with the issue of technology generally in the judiciary. As I said, from the transformation program to the sustaining judiciary transformation program of the current Chief Justice, to technology has been at the center of enhancing access to justice. But as we all know, technology is not cheap. And as I said, one of the fundamental issues we have to ask ourselves as a country is how much we are willing to spend in the judiciary to be able to bring it up to the international standard, or a standard that we think will serve Kenyans. this process requires a lot of investment. And even on the day before COVID, we had already started rolling out initiatives. And perhaps I would say part of the whole issue of online filing had already been piloted was being piloted in the commercial division. But on 16th, we found that suddenly we had to upscale it all over the country. So we are facing teething problems. The problems may be there. I would ask the members of the public to bear with us because we are trying to deal with the problems on a day-to-day basis with the resources we currently have so that we can serve the entire country. We are aware of those problems and our teams are working day and night to ensure that we are able to give you a seamless process of filing cases and of engaging with our technology. Issues of cybersecurity, yes, they're very serious. But again, this is the whole problem of technology. One of the things we also have to think about, some of the platforms we are using, if we have to use them, they require licenses. Are we able to afford those kind of licenses, or do we partner with our universities and institutions and innovators to create a home-based system where we don't have to pay a lot of money out there to provide us secure facilities? All these questions are questions that we have to start interrogating. But all I'll need to say on that particular issue is that please, as our customers, bear with us. We are working day and night to resolve the problems we have with our current system. I was asked about decongestion of prisons. That's very, very important. In many countries now, prisons have been and we take it seriously.
Judge, we have lost you for
most of us, judges, first and second. Yes?
There
I
you are.
lost you for a minute because of the connection. Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yes. I was saying, if I might just repeat what I said, the problems of technology involve investment in technology. And we'll continue having those problems, but we are dealing with them. We are asking our users to be patient with us as we continue upgrading our system and adapting. We are all learning. This is a new experience for each one of us. So, but we note the problems and we are dealing with them. I was asked about decongestion of prisons. In fact, decongestion was very critical in terms of the first 2 weeks because we had to move very, very fast. The law allows us to, the High Court, to review sentences for certain class of offenders. There is a statutory framework for that. We have been able to review those sentences. There are some that deserve, we have to look at the circumstances of each particular case. So there are people who do not deserve because of the circumstances, but we have done the best we can. We have also been able to review bail terms for as many people as we can during that period. One of the instructions magistrates and judges have is where there are people waiting for defense case. For example, you reached a defense case where you are only giving your own sworn or unsworn evidence. The cases are being heard. In fact, one of the judges told me yesterday that somebody who was out on bond on a murder case came to court and said, I am ready to give my defense, please hear me. And the judge obliged, of course, subject to the usual protection. So all that is going on. The process of prerogative of mercy and decongestion are two separate processes. One is executive driven, this one is judiciary driven. The executive process driven takes quite some time. It is not under the judiciary control. So the less I say about it, the better. We are able to deal with what is within our power and authority. Concerning remandees, you remember at each of the CJ statements, it has been clear that you can only hold people for 24 hours before you bring them to court. And that is one thing the courts have not wavered. We sit every day to take pleas of people who have been arrested and who have to be brought to court within 24 hours. So that is going on. If there are people in remand, that is a question of stakeholders to deal with the issues where lawyers can actually have duty advocates to just check up on this particular issue. Are there remandees who are being held beyond 24 hours? That is an issue that requires proactivity even within the stakeholders. But the Constitution is very clear, and on our side, we have been very clear, and we are available to take plea once people are brought from police custody. I know there are also several courts between the station and the courts to be able to deal with those cases expeditiously. Of course, there are issues of fairness, there are issues of injustice, but it's an issue we have to engage with. Issues of electronic evidence that is provided for in the Evidence Act, Section 1 of electronic evidence. One of the benefits of dealing on Zoom and Skype is that the proceedings are recorded so they can be transcribed. But that is an issue we are dealing with. Same as issues of cybersecurity. I know it's a worry for all of us, but again, we are taking each step at a time. As for court orders, I will not comment on cases that are pending. It is always something that saddens each one of us that court orders may be are continually being disobeyed. But then again, it's a judicial process. Anybody who is aggrieved is free to come to court. Honorable Millie Odhiambo talked about tracking and monitoring the standard and quality of judgments. Judgments are delivered every day. Right now, we have a robust system, at least for the superior courts. All our judgments are online. They are available at EKLR, Kenya, the Kenya Law, the reporting website, who have done a commendable job in uploading all the decisions we have been giving. It is the commentators, it is the civil society to be able to critique. They are free for critiquing, and parties who are dissatisfied may appeal. I don't know what other thing we would do to measure those the quality of those judgments, but they are available. They are free of charge, and everybody has access. You may criticize them, you may evaluate them. They are public documents, and through that evaluation, of course, we get to learn our mistakes, and we learn from them. That said, at the end of the day, I think access to justice is a collaborative effort for all of us. We must keep engaging, and I hope there'll be more forums like this where we can tease out ideas on how to improve access. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge. Teresa?
Thank you very much, our panelists. Part of what we're aiming to do is, as we're coming towards the end of the webinar, is to ask ourselves, so what have we said? What are we saying? And some of the issues that have come both from our panelists, but also from our participants, continue to bring in their questions and comments to us is one of the issues, and I think that has come from even just seeing how many questions have been posed to Judge, is just showing how much appetite the public has in terms of wanting to see information concerning access to justice, wanting the judiciary to come out, and have conversations with the public. And this should be encouraged even beyond this platform, and specifically to the judiciary, just to have conversations with the public and inform them on some of these efforts and interventions that we've had from you, Judge Manjanja. The second issue that I've noted is that we need to involve the community in interventions on access to justice. Put very well by Dr. Musumba is let's not speak for them, let's speak with them, let's not speak for them. The other issue is just, to bring in what Judge has just talked about in his ending, that access to justice is a multi-stakeholder, effort. Therefore, calling on the government in terms of budgeting to support the judiciary so that they're able to have both the infrastructure and you know, the ability to be able to dispense justice as is their mandate. The other is promotion on alternative justice systems or other justice systems, and bearing in mind very well what Beatrice has cautioned us in terms of ensuring that as we promote other justice systems, that we're able to you know, look at the circumstances on each case, but also bearing in mind what Dr. Musumba has said, that these justice systems already exist. And indeed, I'm reminded by one of the panelists tuning in, participants tuning in, that the judiciary has indeed carried out a justice needs survey, and it shows, you know, the several justice mechanisms that the public considers as justice mechanisms that go beyond the court, and showing, you know, about 4% of you know, citizens that access the court. So Dr. Linda is you know, is right in saying that already we have a large population that doesn't go to court, and we need to attend to this population. Civil society, as Dawn has said, you know, civil society to come together to highlight these issues, but also to support existing innovations and interventions that will, you know, increase access to justice. And finally, that, you know, the justice sector and access to justice is reliant on the entire justice chain, and therefore calling on the police, calling on the public prosecutor, calling on the prisons and other justice actors to pull together so that we can then offer access to justice to Wanjiku, bearing in mind what my colleague Silas, in terms of the questions, has brought in. We can't have things of disobedience of court orders, you know, and disregarding of things that the court has said, if we're determined to bring justice to Wanjiku. We will have our executive director, Abdul. I'm sure he'll give us closing remarks just before we end. Abdul, are you there?
Yes, I am.
All right, go ahead.
Thank you, Teresa and Silas.
Thank you.
The time we're living in with the pandemic has posed an adverse challenge for those who work in the access to justice and judicial system. The emergency responses to the pandemic by the authorities have in many times clashed with the principles of democratic governance, human rights and rule of law, and have needed to be carefully supervised by the judiciary. The circumstances we are facing now call upon each and every judge to be readily available to serve Wanjiku in a spirit of public service. Whatever happens, access to justice, formal or informal, must continue for every citizen, particularly in matters that involve fundamental rights, for the protection of vulnerable members of the community, and to redress victims of state abuse and victims of gender violence, who are now facing more violations by the curfews, lockdowns, and confinement. We have listened to our panelists and the participants of this webinar, and we are truly thankful to all of them for giving their time and sharing their perspectives and thoughts with us. At ICJ Kenya, we commit to ensure that the discussions don't end here, and that interventions and recommendations on access to justice respond to society's needs. We will continue supporting the judiciary and other justice actors, more so now when the country is fighting COVID-19. We stand together with our members, with colleagues in civil society, the human rights sector, and the legal fraternity in highlighting and advocating for the rights of Wanjiku when these rights are denied, abrogated, or violated. So on behalf of the ICJ Kenya Council and the Secretariat, we thank you, Justice Majanja, Dr. Musumba, our member and our partner Don Dare, and Beatrice for this really enlightening webinar. And thank you again to colleagues at Lawyers Hub for hosting us. Asanteni nyote.
Thank you very much, Abdul. From myself, Teresa Mutua, and my colleague,
Silas Kamanza.
we wish you a very fantastic afternoon. Thank you very much and goodbye.